Welcome back to the channel. This is the Action Figure Grader, and today we're going to take another look at recent sales for loose graded vintage Star Wars items. And for those of you that care about population reports, AFA's population report is finally back up. They had advertised it as being up and it wasn't working, and they just announced yesterday, May 7th, that it's back up, and I did test it out with my Toxic Limbs Bossk Spanish Pock figure to see if it was working, and it is working now. So for those of you that like to see how many of a particular character and a particular variant have been graded, AFA does drop that information now free of charge. And I tried it out for my Bossk, and there are 11 examples of the Spanish Pock Toxic Limbs Bossk that have been graded. So I've got one of the 11. Pretty cool. I know of at least 3 or 4 that have been graded by UKG. I know of 2 that have been graded by CAS. So that gets you to 16 to 18. So there's probably some more loose ones that are ungraded hanging out there. So, 25 has always been kind of the number in my mind as to how many of those exist. But for those of you that have really high, like AFA 90 pluses and 95s, it is kind of a cool thing to go check it out and see where yours sits on the population report. Now we've got some items that I wanted to cover. We've got UKG, CAS, and AFA graded, loose graded items. Everything from vinyl Cape Jawas all the way to the last 17 figures. And we're going to start off with a vinyl Cape Jawa. This was sold by a friend of mine in an auction. UKG 90%. It included the no bump blaster as is labeled there on the UKG label, smooth blaster, vinyl Cape Jawa, Hong Kong variation, UKG 90% gold, so really high grade, new case style. And this one sold at an auction for 2,750 pounds, which equates to about 3,460 US dollars. And, that's down, quite honestly, from where a couple of these have sold. And there was one that sold that was a UKG 90 that sold for about this price, 3,500 or so. There was another that sold for like 4,400 US dollars. So prices seem to be coming back down a little bit for loose graded items, even for the really desirable. I wouldn't call it rare, but I would call it desirable. There's demand for these vinyl Cape Jawas. They're not particularly rare, just given how many we've seen over the last 6 months that have been for sale on eBay, but they are desirable. And it does seem like loose graded prices in general are down, even for the very desirable, not rare, but desirable items. And here's another one. CAS 85 Plus Luke Skywalker double telescoping lightsaber. While the saber was particularly nice, I would argue that it might be a little overgraded. The limbs, the arms, and the bottom of his, the legs, the white portion of his legs don't match perfectly with the torso color. Right? The torso's nice and bright white, but there is a slight pinkish hue to the arms and legs. And it's still got the 85 plus. In my opinion, I would argue that that's a little high. I think if you had broke this out and sent it into AFA, it would probably come back with an 80, would be my guess. Maybe an 80 plus, somewhere in that ballpark. But I don't think it gets an 85 plus. So I would say that this is probably slightly overgraded. Now, the market's smart, right? They're not dumb. And, they realize that it's probably a little overgraded for what it is. It's still a beautiful, very desirable item. But it sold for $14.31 in an auction. And, the saber was beautiful. I mean, that's a really nice looking saber. But, an 85 plus AFA would probably be $2,200 to $2,500, even in what I would call a down market. So the market's saying, hey, this is really more like an 80 or an 80 plus grade. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with having an 80 for a double telescoping saber. But this is graded 85 plus, and it was also a lettered saber hilt, AA on the hilt there. Hong Kong, obviously. And this is the 3-line Luke Skywalker Farm Boy. There are particular 3 lines that did come with the double telescoping saber. The earlier versions were the 2-line Hong Kongs. So very cool figure, though. The same seller also had a dark green chest, brown belt Hong Kong. So a fairly common version of Boba Fett, graded CAS 85. That sold for $175.50. Pretty good deal, I feel like, there. And then here was a CAS 90, and this one was the Taiwan with the dark brown belt. That one sold for $385, which I think, that's probably about right. That equates to probably what an AFA 85 Plus would sell for. And an AFA 85 goes usually like 250 to 275. This was graded a CAS 90, so I'm just kind of putting it apples to apples when you compare it to CAS versus AFA graded. So I think that was, both of those prices were pretty fair. Now, was it a 90? You could argue maybe there's some belt issues there. There's like, some light paint wear to the top of the belt. It's very minor, but, to me, it looks like there is some minor belt wear, and it's still got the 90, which, is probably a little overgraded in my opinion, but still a very desirable figure. I'm not trying to crap on CAS or this figure. I'm just saying that, there are certain figures that AFA grades more harshly than UKG or CAS does. And I would say that Boba Fett's definitely one of them. The Luke Farm Boy and Stormtroopers are two others that come to mind, where I would say that CAS and UKG grade them a little faster and looser than AFA does. Here, speaking of AFA, here was an AFA 85 Stormtrooper. This was the China COO. And, it could be the lighting. The lighting wasn't great for this. It kind of it puts off like a yellow tint in the photos. And, there was some kind of very light wear to the hip areas. You can see there. The hands look pretty good. Maybe a little bit of wear to that left hand there. But, it was very, very nice. It did get the 85 grade. It was a China COO versus the Hong Kong, which usually have deeper, darker blacks versus the China paint apps. This one sold for $251.50. So this is another one where the market basically said, for a China COO, we're not going to give you the same kind of price that a Hong Kong AFA 85 Stormtrooper will give you. Because we've seen some AFA 85s that have gone for quite a bit more money than this. But that was still a very nice, desirable figure. It was just probably either an older grade, which I didn't look up the certification number, but or it's just the China factories did not kind of put that black, really dark, deep black paint that you see, especially on the hip area for this particular figure. Next up was a AFA 85 Death Squad Commander with the dark blue emblem. Now, this one sold for $217.50, which I would argue was a pretty good deal. That figure looked every bit of an 85 to me. I mean, you'd be hard-pressed to really find any kind of issues with it. There might be, it's hard to tell because it's still in the kind of poly bag, but there might be a slight scuff on the back silver plate on the belt there. Hard to tell, but let's argue that it is a slight scuff there that maybe kept the price down. Usually like an AFA 85 Death Squad Commander, I say like 260 to 275 is about the right number usually. So this was one where maybe the very discerning collector looked at that back emblem on the back there and said, okay, there's a little scuff. It's probably a low 85. I would be perfectly fine having this in my collection, though, don't get me wrong. And I think $217.50 was a great deal. Next up was an AFA 85 Death Star droid. And this is one where I thought it looked every bit of an 85. The first thing I always look at for Death Star droids, loose graded, are the shoulders, the black part of the shoulders, and then the eyes. Because sometimes some AFA 85s sneak through that have scratches on either the shoulders or the eyes. This one looks like just it has reflections, the reflections of the light from taking the photos. It looked every bit of an 85 to me, and to get it for $168, that's a good deal. That's a really, really good deal there. That's a price I would have paid in a heartbeat. Very, very nice deal, I think. The other good thing to look at is the eyes for the Death Star droid, because sometimes the eyes can be kind of off-kilter. I've got an AFA 85 loose graded that did have some kind of wonky-looking, uneven eyes. You could maybe say this one is a little bit more round, like the if you're looking at this figure head on, the left eye looks perfectly round, while the right eye has more like an oval. So, it could just be the angles, but it looks to me, he looks a little wonky, not nearly as wonky as mine. But $168.60, good deal for that one. Here was a no COO Han Solo in his Bespin outfit, archival case, AFA 85 new case style. That one sold for $169.50. Another fairly common figure, but it is the harder to find no COO. These appeared on Palatoys or Tri-Logo card backs. So I think that was a pretty good deal. It looked every bit of an 85 to me. I don't see anything wrong with that figure just at first blush. Here was an AFA 85 orange logo AT driver or AT driver. There's also a red logo. So this one has the orange logo on the helmet. AFA 85, 150, 350. That's a great deal too. And the first thing to always look for on the AT-AT driver is the back, the butt. And this one had some kind of weird kind of brown discoloration around the stripe on the back of the butt. And he also had a little scuff on the back of the butt there. So, his butt's still a lot cleaner than mine. I need a shower really bad. So this one is very nice though. I mean, I'm not, again, I'm just giving you, these are tips to look for loose graded figures. This is not me disparaging the figures, okay? It's just kind of tips to look for. The other thing to look for, obviously the hands. And this one did have some very noticeable scuffs on both hands. You know, you can see some wear on both hands there. Particularly that thumb's got a big scratch, and then that knuckle has a scratch. So, is it an 85? You know, I think if you take it out and resubmit it to AFA, it probably gets an 80 plus. I mean, that's just a fact. I think it's a lower grade AFA 85, or it's degraded slightly in the case since it was graded. So that's why it sold for relatively cheap at $153.50. Nothing wrong with it at all. I'm just, trying to point out some things. Now, here's an interesting one. Okay, so this is CAS, which we know grades looser, but it's a Luke Skywalker X-Wing pilot, and it was graded CAS 90. It was graded June of 2022, so a fairly recent grade. Now, I can tell you from experience, it is impossible. I don't care if it's UKG, CAS, or AFA. It is impossible to get a high grade. I sent in a Luke Skywalker X-Wing pilot that was literally from a box of overstock, untouched figures. They were perfect. Chris W. over at Rogue 5 Toys gave me one for like $35, right? And it was, I mean, I could not find anything wrong with it, and it still got a CAS 85. So to get a 90 grade on this one, I mean, looking at it, it looks like a 90. Look how perfectly white the figure is. You could argue maybe it's got some overspray from the white vest onto the black stripe there. So maybe that was a little generous, but the white straps are known to get, even factory fresh, they're known to have issues around there, or some overspray around the boots. These are all kind of common issues. Looking at the front of the figure, there's a little scratch right there on the white of the vest, but, the helmet looks pretty good. I think that if you crack this thing out and send it in 10 times, it would get a 90 1 or 2 times out of 10. It's just impossible to get a 90. So whoever graded this was maybe a little generous, but it still sold for $232, which is a very fair price. I mean, there's a UKG 85% blank raised bar that is the Luke X-Wing that is for sale for like $300. And I sent it out to my Patreon supporters. And I said, this is a pretty good deal. $300 for a harder to find blank raised bar. This is the Hong Kong. I mean, to me, you grab it, right? And it still hasn't sold yet. So this is the more common 3-line Hong Kong. But I still think, I have no way to prove this, but if I had unlimited money, I would do that experiment for the channel, just for you guys. I would crack this thing out and resubmit it to CAS and see what it got. And I would resubmit it to AFA, and I think it would get an 85 all day from CAS and UKG. But to get the 90 again, if I sent it to CAS, I don't think it would get a 90. I know it wouldn't get a 90 with AFA. They don't give 90s for Luke X-Wings ever. But I think it would get an 85 if you resubmitted this to all 3 grading companies right now. I just think to get a 90, it's so hard to do. So 231, 232, I think it was a good deal to get it. Next, and again, I'm not crapping on CAS. I'm just saying that there is variation with it. This is an art. Grading is an art, not a science. Okay, and maybe with the advent of AI, not to divert away from these figures for too much, but maybe with the advent of AI, that the grading companies do figure out a way to add AI scanning technology to look for defects and to compare it to past examples that they've graded, and then AI can then slot this in, based on the number of defects that it finds, if any, slot it in versus other examples. And then, maybe a human grader could take the AI results and then adjust as necessary. That's where I think the most likely implementation of AI will be used, is to kind of use it as a second set of eyes. The human then uses their eyes to compare the score that it came with AI. I don't think it'll go over to AI only grading. I really don't. I know that there's some trading card companies that do that. I'd be curious to see, though, how AI gets implemented with the grading companies. I think it's coming, though. I think you'll be surprised at how quickly it comes. Probably at AFA first. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think AFA probably implements it first, and then CAS and or UKG tries it out later on. Maybe once it becomes a more refined technology. I think it's a little early right now, but we'll see. We'll see. We're already seeing it everywhere else, so it's just a matter of time before it gets implemented with the grading companies. Next up was a beautiful Spanish PBP Scar COO Hoth Stormtrooper, graded UKG 80%. And this is one I did send out to my Patreon supporters. They got snapped up immediately. It's an 80%, but I think it's every bit of an 80%. Beautiful paintwork on this one. Not really sure why it got the 80, to be honest with you. I mean, you could maybe argue there's some paint wear to the back of the figure on the back of the backpack. There's some light scratches there in the black portion. Otherwise, pretty nice looking figure. I mean, that's a really, really nice 80%. It had a figure score of 80, paint 85, cape 80%. So, it's almost like they didn't really ding the black paint scratches on the back of the backpack if it got a paint score of 85. It looks like maybe there's a scratch in the cape right there. You can see a little scratch right there. So maybe that's what did it. But that's a very high-end 80%. We just talked about some examples from AFA that are low-end 85s. This I qualify as a high-end 80%. And it was only for sale for $120. This is a Spanish PBP. I mean, that was a bargain in my opinion. Even with shipping to the US, it would have been $175. That's a strong buy. That's a strong buy. So I'm not surprised that it got bought immediately. Next up was another one I had in my What to Buy video. This was a UKG 90% Palatoy baggie for Wicket. I just think that if you ever see graded Palatoy baggies, grab them if they're fairly priced. This one was $200 plus shipping, so $240. And you got to remember that an AFA 85 loose graded Wicket probably goes for slightly less than that, like 200-ish. So to me, to get a UKG 90% Palatoy baggie, grab it, man. This is a beautiful case style too. I love the deluxe cases that UKG uses. Easily the best cases for baggies, in my opinion, followed closely by CAS with their baggie style. But anyway, to me, if I see a baggie that is a Palatoy baggie that's graded and authenticated, and it's a fairly priced one, it's just harder to find foreign baggies in my experience. Here was another one. This was a Palatoy baggie for Leia in her Bush disguise. This is one I watched for a while, and I was tempted by it. It sold at $220 US or make an offer. I think it might have been a make an offer on this one, but it was 90%. So very, very nice one there. Very pale face there. It's not as pale as some I've seen, but that's a pretty pale face for the Hong Kong figure. Hong Kong baggie, but it was a Palatoy in baggie. So very cool. Looks like it did have a little torso discoloration. So not sure how it got the 90%, but it could just be my imagination there. Same seller also had a UKG 90% for General Lando pilot. And this one sold for 350 pounds, which is $440 US. Every bit of a 90. I mean, that is a gorgeous figure. Look at the paint apps on the chest and everything. Very, very nice figure. So I can see the desire to pay that price for what looked to be a pretty much perfect General Lando. Here was a UKG 85% EV99 with the coin encased. I thought this was a great looking case. And that one sold for 345 pounds, which is $435 US. Even with shipping to the US, that puts you at about $470. I think that's a pretty good deal, given that the coin is included. And it was a very high grade. Very nice example. Finally, we had a UKG 85% yak face, brand new case style. I like how UKG encases the staff in an etched accessory case instead of a brackets like CAS and AFA use. I just think it looks a lot nicer. It's a much more professional, cleaner look, and the staff doesn't wiggle around inside those brackets. It just looks better. That one sold for 495 pounds, which is $622 US. Again, this is another one I sent out to my Patreons. I don't know if they bought it or not, but I thought it was worth every penny of that price, given what we pay for these types of figures over here in the US, loose and ungraded. So pretty nice assortment. I hope you enjoyed this look. Thanks as always for watching, and I'll be back soon.